Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. In the West, shadows have a way of growing long and dark, swallowing up the light and the law. But sometimes, from the deepest shadows, a different kind of darkness emerges, not of evil, but of a fierce, protective justice. This is the story of a woman whose world had gone dark, and the two brothers, born of shadow, who would become her unlikely dawn. The town of Redemption was a place of two faces. By day, it was a sleepy, sun-baked collection of false-fronted buildings, a place where folks went about their business with a quiet, weary determination. But when the sun went down, the town's other face emerged. A harder, crueler face. The shadows in the alleys grew teeth, and the law, in the form of the town's perpetually drunk sheriff, went to bed early. Anna knew the night's face all too well. For the past 6 months, since the day her husband, Daniel, had been killed in a senseless barroom brawl, she had been living in the town's longest shadow of grief, of poverty, and of a vulnerability that was as palpable as a scent to the predators who prowled the darkness. She was a widow, a word that felt like a shroud. Daniel had been a good man, a blacksmith with strong hands and a kind heart. He had been her rock, her shield against the harshness of this land. With him gone, she was adrift. She had sold the smithy to pay his debts, and now she survived on a patchwork of odd jobs, mending clothes, scrubbing floors at the hotel, anything to keep a roof over her head and food on the table. She was a strong woman, with a core of prairie-forged steel, but the constant struggle was wearing her down. She saw the way the men in town looked at her now, not with the respect they had shown the blacksmith's wife, but with a different, hungrier kind of appraisal. She was a lone woman, unprotected, and in a town like Redemption, that was a dangerous thing to be. The predator who watched her most closely was a man named Silas Thorne, the town's unofficial king. Thorne owned the saloon, the hotel, and, it was whispered, the sheriff. He was a man who dealt in the dark commerce of the frontier, land grabbing, smuggling, and, for the right price, people. Anna was on her way home late one evening, a small bag of groceries clutched in her hand. She was taking her usual shortcut, a narrow, dark alley that ran behind the general store. It was a foolish thing to do, she knew, but she was tired, and the thought of her small, lonely room was a powerful lure. They were waiting for her, 3 of them, their shapes detaching themselves from the deeper shadows of the alley. They were Thorne's men, hired thugs with dead eyes and cruel, sneering mouths. Well, the leader, a man named Riggs, said, his voice a low, menacing growl. Look what we have here. The pretty little widow, all by herself. Anna's heart leaped into her throat. She clutched her grocery bag like a shield and tried to back away. Leave me alone, she said, her voice a trembling whisper. Now, why would we do that? Riggs sneered, advancing on her. Mister, Thorne has been admiring you from afar. He thinks you'd fetch a high price down in the mining camps. A woman with your spirit. They like that. The cold, brutal reality of his words hit her like a physical blow. They weren't just trying to rob her. They were taking her. She turned to run, but they were too fast. They grabbed her, their rough hands bruising her arms. She screamed, but the sound was muffled as one of them clamped a filthy hand over her mouth. She fought. She kicked and scratched and bit, a wildcat fighting for her life. But she was 1 against 3. They were laughing, enjoying her struggle. They began to drag her, half carrying, half pulling her, deeper into the alley, towards a waiting wagon. Despair, a cold black wave, was beginning to wash over her. This was it. This was how her story ended. Dragged away in the dark, to be sold like an animal. It was in that moment of absolute, hopeless despair that the voice came. It was a voice of pure, raw, and unadulterated command. A voice that seemed to come from the very shadows themselves, a voice that was not a plea, but a judgment. You're ours now, Mov. The words were a bellow, a roar of absolute authority that echoed off the alley walls. It was so unexpected, so powerful, that it froze Thorne's men in their tracks. They stopped, their heads snapping round towards the mouth of the alley. 2 figures stood there, silhouetted against the faint light of the main street. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and they stood with an easy, predatory grace that made Thorne's thugs look like clumsy amateurs. They were identical, their faces hidden in the shadows, their long dusters hanging to their ankles. Twins. Riggs, recovering from his surprise, let out a harsh laugh. Well, look what we have here. A couple of heroes. He shoved Anna towards one of his men. Get rid of them. The two thugs drew their pistols and advanced on the two strangers. The figures at the mouth of the alley did not move. They did not draw their guns. They just stood there, waiting. And then, as the two thugs got closer, they moved. It was a blur of motion, a synchronized dance of brutal, efficient violence. The twin on the left sidestepped his opponent's clumsy lunge and brought the butt of his pistol down on the back of the man's head. The thug collapsed without a sound. The twin on the right met his attacker head-on. He didn't use a gun. He used his hands. A sharp, blocking motion. A quick, powerful strike to the throat. The second thug crumpled to the ground, gagging and clutching his neck. It was over in 2 heartbeats. Riggs stared, his jaw slack, his bravado gone, replaced by a dawning, terrible fear. He was a bully, used to fighting those who were weaker. He was not prepared for this. He shoved Anna to the ground and drew his own gun, firing a wild, panicked shot. The twins moved apart, melting back into the shadows on either side of the alley. Riggs was now trapped between them, his eyes darting back and forth, trying to find a target in the darkness. "Who are you?" he shrieked, his voice cracking. The only answer was the click of 2 hammers being cocked in the darkness. Riggs, in a final act of cowardice, turned and fled, scrambling out the back of the alley and disappearing into the night. The alley fell silent, the only sounds the pained groans of the 2 unconscious thugs and the frantic beating of Anna's own heart. The 2 figures emerged from the shadows. They were young, no older than 25, and their faces were strikingly, unnervingly identical. They had the same dark, unruly hair, the same strong jaws, and the same eyes the color of a stormy sea, filled with a strange, old sadness that seemed at odds with their youth. One of them, his face a hard, unreadable mask, walked over and checked on the 2 downed men. The other twin came to Anna. He knelt down beside her, his movements surprisingly gentle. "Are you all right, Mom?" he asked, his voice a low, quiet rumble, a stark contrast to the commanding roar he had used moments before. Anna could only nod, her mind a whirlwind of shock and a dawning, incredible relief. "My name is Liam," the gentle one said. He gestured to his brother. "And that's Jake." She looked at them, at these 2 strange, dangerous men who had appeared from nowhere and saved her. They were not lawmen. They were not heroes, not in the traditional sense. They were something else. Something wilder, darker, and infinitely more dangerous. Jake, his inspection of the thugs complete, walked over. He looked down at Anna, and his eyes, like his brother's, held no gentleness. They were cold, hard, and assessing. "You can't stay here," he said, his voice a flat, hard command. "Thorne will send more men. He won't let this go." He looked at his brother. "We have what we came for. Let's go." Liam looked from his brother to the terrified, trembling woman on the ground. A silent argument seemed to pass between them. Finally, Liam looked back at Anna. "He's right," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You're not safe here anymore. You're coming with us." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Anna, who had just been saved from one set of captors, found herself in the hands of another. But as she looked from the cold, hard face of Jake to the quiet, sad eyes of Liam, she knew that this was a different kind of captivity. She had been dragged from one shadow, only to be claimed by another, darker and more mysterious one. Her desperate struggle for survival in the town of Redemption had just taken a very, very strange turn. The twins, Jake and Liam, were studying contrasts, 2 sides of the same tarnished coin. Jake was the storm, his movements sharp, his voice a hard, cutting edge. Liam was the quiet after the storm, his presence a calm, watchful stillness. But they moved with a synchronized and spoken understanding that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling to watch. They did not take Anna to a hotel or a boarding house. They led her through the back alleys of Redemption to a place she had never known existed, a small, hidden stable, tucked away behind the abandoned Assy office. It was their lair, a temporary, anonymous refuge from the world. Inside, the stable was neat and orderly. 2 powerful-looking horses stood in their stalls. Saddles and gear were hung with a soldier's precision. This was the home of men who were used to being on the move, who traveled light and left no trace. Liam, the gentler of the two, tended to Anna's scrapes and bruises with a surprising tenderness. He brought her water and a piece of bread, his movements slow and reassuring. Jake, meanwhile, stood by the door, a silent, brooding guardian, his stormy eyes scanning the dark alley outside, his hand never far from the Colt on his hip. "Who are you?" Anna finally asked, her voice a little stronger now, the shock beginning to recede, replaced by a deep, powerful curiosity. It was Liam who answered. "We're just passing through," he said, his voice a low, evasive rumble. "Men who are just passing through don't usually start wars with the most powerful man in town," she countered, a spark of her old, fiery spirit returning. A faint, sad smile touched Liam's lips. "Sometimes, the war finds you." Jake turned from the door, his gaze hard. "We have our own business with Thorn," he said, his voice a flat, final statement that discouraged further questions. "You just happened to get in the middle of it." Their business. Anna began to piece together the fragments of gossip she had heard in town. Thorn had enemies, of course. But these two, they were different. They were not common outlaws. They moved with a skill, a purpose, that spoke of something deeper. They let her rest in a small, clean stall filled with fresh straw. It was a strange, surreal situation. She was a captive, of a sort, but she felt safer here, in this hidden stable with these two dangerous strangers, than she had felt in her own lonely room for the past 6 months. She learned more about them not from their words, but from their actions. She saw the way Liam would sometimes stare into the distance, a look of profound, ancient sadness in his eyes. She saw the way Jake's hands, when he thought no one was watching, would clench and unclench, as if he were holding onto a rage so immense it was a physical effort to contain it. They were men who were haunted. The next day, they did not leave. "Thorn's men will be watching the roads," Jake said. "We wait. We let him make the next move." The stable became their small, self-contained world. The three of them existed in a strange, tense truce. Liam would talk to her, in his quiet, gentle way, asking her about her husband, about her life before redemption. He was a man who understood grief. Jake, on the other hand, rarely spoke to her. But she would often find his eyes on her, his expression a mixture of cold assessment and a strange, almost reluctant, concern. The story of their past, the source of their ghosts, was revealed on the second night. Anna was woken by a sound from the main part of the stable. It was a low, choked cry of anguish. She crept to the door of her stall and peered out. Liam was in the throes of a nightmare, his body rigid, his hands clenched. Jake was beside him, his hand on his brother's shoulder, his own face a mask of pained, helpless anguish. "It's all right, Liam," Jake was whispering, his voice a raw, ragged sound she had never heard before. "It's over. She's gone." The next morning, the atmosphere in the stable was heavy with unspoken echoes of the night. It was Anna who broke the silence. "You lost someone," she said to Liam, her voice soft. It wasn't a question. Liam looked up, his eyes filled with a raw, fresh grief. He nodded, unable to speak. It was Jake who told the story, his voice a flat, emotionless monotone, as if he were recounting a tale that had happened to someone else. Their family, their father, mother, and younger sister, Sarah, had been settlers, traveling west on the promise of a new life. They had settled in a small valley, a place not unlike redemption, a place run by a man like Silas Thorn, a man who had wanted their land. He had tried to drive them out with threats and intimidation. When that didn't work, he had sent his men. It had not been a fair fight. It had been a massacre. Jake and Liam, who had been out hunting, had returned to find their home in flames, and their family gone. "They took our sister," Jake said, his voice as cold and dead as a winter grave. "Sarah. She was 16. Thorn. He sold her. Just like he was going to sell you." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Their war with Thorn was not about business. It was a blood feud. A quest for a vengeance so profound it had consumed their lives. "We were too late to save her," Liam said, his voice finally returning, a choked, broken whisper. "We spent 5 years hunting the men who did it. We found them all, but we never found him. The man at the top of the chain. Until now. They had come to redemption to kill Silas Thorn. To finally, after all these years, avenge their sister. Anna looked at these two young men, who were not men at all, but boys who had been forced to become killers, their youth stolen by a single, brutal act of violence. And her heart ached for them. She, who had thought her own grief was the heaviest burden in the world, saw in them a sorrow that was deeper, darker, than anything she had ever known. She understood now. Their bellowed cry in the alley, "You're ours now," it had not been a claim of ownership. It had been a declaration of protection. In her, they had not seen a victim. They had seen their sister. And they had, in that moment, refused to be too late a second time. She was no longer their captive. She was their cause, their chance at a redemption of their own. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice a soft whisper. "We will finish it," Jake said, his eyes like chips of ice. "We will burn his whole rotten world to the ground." The shadow of their past was long and dark, and it had fallen over all three of them. Anna was no longer just a widow struggling to survive. She was now a soldier in a private war, an ally to two avenging angels who had been born from the ashes of a tragedy so profound it had turned them into shadows themselves. The revelation of the twins' past transformed the tense and certain atmosphere in the stable into something new, a grim, focused alliance. Anna was no longer just a person they had rescued. She was the living embodiment of their quest for vengeance. And they were no longer her mysterious captors, they were her sworn protectors, two avenging angels who saw in her face the ghost of their lost sister. "Thorn will not let the attack in the alley go unanswered," Jake stated, his voice the cold, hard instrument of a tactician. "He will see it as a direct challenge to his authority. He will tear this town apart looking for us. So we cannot stay here," Liam added, his gaze on Anna, a question in his sad eyes. "Where can we go?" Anna asked. "He owns everything." "Not everything," Jake said, a faint, humorless smile touching his lips. "He owns the town. But he does not own the wild. He is a man of walls and deals. He is not a man of the earth." Their plan was to disappear, to become ghosts in the wilderness that surrounded redemption, a wilderness that was Thorn's blind spot. From there, they would wage their war. They left that night, under the cover of a moonless sky. They moved like shadows, their three horses' hooves muffled in the thick dust of the back alleys. They slipped out of town, not on the main road, but on an old, forgotten cattle trail that led up into the high, broken country of the mesas. For the next week, the wilderness became their sanctuary. Jake and Liam were as at home in the rugged and forgiving landscape as they had been in the shadows of the town. They taught Anna the skills of survival they had learned in their 5 years on the Vengeance Trail. They taught her how to read the land, how to find water where there seemed to be none. They taught her how to move silently, how to use the terrain for cover. And they taught her how to fight. Jake was a relentless and forgiving instructor. He taught her how to use a knife, how to handle a pistol not with fear, but with a cold, detached efficiency. "The gun is a tool," he would say, his voice hard. "No different from a hammer or an axe. You do not fear the tool. You master it." Liam was the one who taught her the art of the rifle, of patience, of the single, well-aimed shot. "It is not about speed," he would tell her, his voice a low, calming murmur. "It is about stillness. You become the rock. You become the wind. You and the target are the only two things in the world." She was a quick study, her own resilience and determination a fertile ground for their harsh lessons. The soft, grieving widow was being stripped away, layer by layer, revealing a core of pure, unadulterated steel. She was not just learning to survive, she was learning to become a predator. As they trained, they also planned. Their war on Thorn would not be a direct assault. It would be a war of 1,000 cuts. A war of attrition. "Thorn's power comes from two things," Jake explained, as they sat around a small, smokeless campfire. "His money, and the fear he inspires. We will take both from him." Their first target was his money. Thorn was running a large-scale cattle rustling operation, using his vast ranch as a clearinghouse for stolen herds from all over the territory. The cattle were his main source of untraceable income. Their plan was simple and audacious. They would not try to steal the cattle back. They would simply set them free. They spent 3 days scouting Thorn's massive ranch from the high mesas. It was a fortress, with dozens of armed outriders. But it was too big to guard effectively. They chose their target, a large holding pen, miles from the main house, where a herd of several hundred stolen cattle were being held, their brands expertly altered. waiting to be driven to the railhead. They struck at night, during a raging thunderstorm that masked the sound of their approach. They were three ghosts, moving through the driving rain. They overpowered the two lazy guards at the pen, not with guns, but with silent, efficient force. Then, they simply opened the gates. With whoops and yells, they stampeded the massive herd out into the open range, scattering them in 100 different directions across the vast, storm-swept plains. It would take Thorn's men weeks to round up even half of them. They had cost him a fortune, and they had done it without firing a single lethal shot. Their second attack was on his fear. Thorn had a monthly payroll shipment for his network of hired guns and corrupt officials, which he brought in on a private wagon, heavily guarded. The twins and Anna did not attack the wagon. They attacked the idea of the wagon. They created a rumor, a whisper that started in the saloons and gambling dens of the surrounding towns. They spread the story that the payroll wagon was going to be hit by a new, phantom gang, a gang that struck like ghosts and left no survivors. The rumor, fueled by the stories of the early fight and the scattered cattle, took on a life of its own. The men hired to guard the payroll wagon, already on edge, became terrified. They began to desert. When the day of the payroll shipment came, the wagon rode out with a guard of only 4 men, the rest having refused the duty. The twins and Anna didn't have to attack it. The 4 guards, spooked by every shadow, every sound on the wind, panicked at the sight of a dust devil, and fled, abandoning the wagon and its precious cargo in the middle of the road. They had taken Thorn's money, and they had turned his own weapon, fear, against him. The alliance of the damned two brothers haunted by the past and the woman who was fighting for a future had fired their first shots in their war. They were a small, insignificant force against a powerful man, but they were also a whisper on the wind, a shadow on the trail, a rumor that was quickly becoming a legend. And they were just getting started. The raids on Silas Thorn's cattle and his payroll were not just acts of sabotage. They were statements. They were whispers in the dark that began to spread through the territory like a prairie fire. The stories grew with each telling, a phantom gang that could scatter a herd of 1,000 cattle in a single night. A crew of ghosts so terrifying that armed guards would abandon a fortune rather than face them. Thorn, in his opulent ranch house, was a man besieged. He had lost a fortune, and more importantly, he was losing his grip. Fear was the currency of his empire, and now, someone else was spending it more effectively than he was. His men were spooked. His allies were growing nervous. The foundations of his kingdom were beginning to crack. He became obsessed. He put a massive bounty on the heads of the Ghost Riders, though he had no idea who they were. He hired a new army of ruthless, hard-faced gunslingers, promising them a fortune to hunt down this new threat. The wilderness, which had been a sanctuary for Anna and the twins, was no longer safe. The hunt for them was on. Jake, Liam, and Anna were forced to move deeper into the Badlands, their movements more cautious, their camps colder and more hidden. They were no longer the hunters, they were the hunted. The constant danger and the close, forced proximity began to change the dynamic between them. The formal alliance began to morph into something more complex, something akin to a family. Jake, the hard, silent storm, began to soften, just a little. He found in Anna a strategic mind that was the equal of his own, and a courage that he grudgingly began to respect. He was still the leader, the protector, but he began to listen to her, to value her opinion. Liam, the quiet, gentle soul, found in Anna a kindred spirit. They would spend hours talking, sharing the stories of the lives they had lost, finding a strange, sad comfort in their shared grief. A deep and spoken affection began to grow between them, the tender green shoot of a new life in the barren soil of their sorrow. And Anna, the woman who had been a victim, a survivor, a soldier, was now becoming something else. A leader. She was the heart of their small, desperate band, her resilience the glue that held them together. The war entered a new, more personal phase. Thorn, unable to find them in the wilderness, went after the one thing he knew they had a connection to, the town of redemption. He began to squeeze the town, to punish it for its perceived role in their defiance. He called in debts, foreclosed on businesses, and his new army of thugs swaggered through the streets, terrorizing the populace. The news reached them via a traveling preacher, who told the story of a town living in a new reign of terror. "He's trying to draw us out," Jake said, his voice a low, angry growl. "He's using the town as bait." We can't let him, Anna said, her voice firm. Those people. They did nothing. We are 3 people, Jake countered, his voice hard with a pragmatism born of a lifetime of fighting impossible odds. We cannot fight a town full of hired guns. No, Anna said, and a new, dangerous light was in her eyes. We are not 3 people. We are an idea. And an idea can be much more powerful than an army. Her plan was the most audacious one yet. They would not ride into redemption with guns blazing. They would send a message that would turn Thorne's own terror against him. They knew that Thorne's new army was a mercenary force, their loyalty only to his gold. And they knew from their own network of whispers that Thorne was paying them from a massive, private war chest he kept in a secret, iron-doored vault in the back of his saloon. Their target was not the men, it was the vault. They devised a plan that was a symphony of their combined skills. Liam, the patient sniper, would be the distraction. Jake, the master of infiltration, would be the weapon. And Anna, the strategist, the heart, would be the voice. They struck on the night of a new moon. Liam took a position on a high butte overlooking the town. He began to fire his rifle, not at the town, but into the hills around it, creating a series of echoing, disembodied shots that made it sound as if a large, attacking force was gathering in the darkness. Thorne's men, already on edge, reacted as expected. They poured out of the saloons and into the streets, firing wildly at the shadows, their attention completely focused on the phantom army in the hills. While the town was distracted by this ghost attack, Jake and Anna slipped into the back alleys. They made their way to the saloon. Jake, with a set of tools he had fashioned himself, worked on the lock of the vault's heavy iron door. He was a master, and in minutes, the door was open. They did not take the money. They did something far more devastating. They took a single stick of dynamite and a long fuse. They placed the charge not to blow the door off, but to fuse the locking mechanism, to turn the vault into an impenetrable steel tomb. They lit the fuse and slipped away. As they were leaving, Anna posted a single, handwritten note on the front door of the saloon. The explosion was not a massive one. It was a dull, powerful crump that was barely heard over the sound of the ongoing gunfight. But in the morning, when a furious Silas Thorne discovered what had happened, he found his fortune sealed away, inaccessible. And he found the note. It was not a threat. It was a promise. It said, "The people of this territory are no longer your property. Your reign is over. Leave now, and you may live. Stay, and the next time we come for you, we will not be coming for your money." It was not signed by a name. It was signed with a single, crudely drawn symbol, a simple, 5-pointed star. The same star that had been on the locket of their sister, Sarah. The whisper of the ghostwriters had become a roar. They had given themselves a name, a symbol. They were no longer just a rumor. They were the regulators. And they had just declared open war on Silas Thorne and everything he represented. The sealed vault was a declaration of war that Silas Thorne could not ignore. It was not just an act of sabotage, it was an act of profound, public humiliation. He, the untouchable king of redemption, had been robbed, not of his gold, but of his access to it. He had been rendered impotent by a phantom enemy who signed their work with a single, defiant star. His reign of terror over the town intensified. He was a man possessed, his paranoia turning to a raging, indiscriminate fury. He and his men tore the town apart, searching for any clue, any whisper, that might lead them to the so-called regulators. Public floggings for minor infractions became common. Businesses were burned on the mere suspicion of harboring sympathies for the rebels. Redemption became a town under military occupation. For Jake, Liam, and Anna, hiding in the high mesas, the news from the town was a torment. They had intended to liberate the people, not to bring down a greater wrath upon them. "We have to do something," Liam said, his gentle soul agonized by the suffering they had indirectly caused. "We have to go in." "And do what?" Jake countered, his voice a hard, cold rasp of pragmatism. "Get ourselves killed. We are 3 people, Liam. 3. We cannot win a pitched battle." "Then what do we do?" Liam asked, his voice filled with a desperate frustration. "We just hide up here while he burns the town to the ground." It was Anna who saw the path forward. She had spent the past weeks not just training as a fighter, but as a leader. She had listened to the stories of the twins, had studied the tactics of their enemy. "Jake is right," she said, her voice a quiet, calming force that cut through the tension between the two brothers. "We cannot win by force. But Thorn has a weakness. His army. They are not loyalists. They are mercenaries. They are here for his gold. And right now, his gold is locked in a vault he cannot open." Her plan was not to attack Thorn's army, but to steal it. They began a new, more subtle campaign. They were no longer just ghosts of violence. They were ghosts of temptation. They sent messages, whispers on the wind. They used traveling peddlers, friendly prospectors, to spread a new rumor through the ranks of Thorn's hired guns. The rumor was simple. The regulators were hiring. They had Thorn's gold, or so the rumor claimed, and they were willing to pay double what Thorn was offering for any man who was willing to switch his allegiance. It was a brilliant piece of psychological warfare. It sowed dissent and suspicion in Thorn's ranks. The mercenaries, already on edge from fighting an invisible enemy, now began to look at each other with greedy, distrustful eyes. Was their partner planning to desert? Could they trust the man standing next to them? Thorn, seeing his army beginning to rot from the inside out, was forced to act. He could not afford to lose his men. He had to make an example. He found 2 of his men whispering about the regulators' offer and had them hanged in the town square, a brutal, desperate attempt to restore order through fear. It was a fatal miscalculation. The public hanging did not instill fear. It ignited a rebellion. The mercenaries, who had signed on for a profitable, easy job, had not signed on to be hanged by their own employer for a mere conversation. That night, a dozen of Thorn's best men deserted. They did not go to join the regulators. They simply vanished into the night, wanting no more part of Thorn's madness. His army was crumbling. Now, it was time for the final move. The final act of the war. Jake, Liam, and Anna decided to give Thorn the battle he so desperately wanted. But it would be on their terms, on their ground. They sent him a message, a note delivered by a brave, young boy, pinned to the door of his own saloon. It was a direct challenge. "You want a war, Thorn. You will have it. Dawn, 3 days from now. At the place it all began for us. The old Miller homestead. Come alone, if you are man enough. Or bring your army. It makes no difference. We will be waiting." It was signed with the single, stark image of a star. The Miller homestead was the ruins of their own home, the place where their family had been massacred. It was a place of ghosts, a place of profound, personal meaning. To challenge him there was to turn their quest for vengeance into a final, sacred rite. Thorn, his army now reduced to a mere handful of his most loyal, or most terrified men, knew it was a trap. But his pride, his rage, his obsessive need to crush these ghosts who had so thoroughly humiliated him, would not let him refuse. He would go to the Miller homestead. He would bring every man he had left. And he would wipe the memory of the regulators from the face of the earth. As the sun set on the 3rd day, the 3 figures who called themselves the regulators took their positions in the burned-out ruins of the old homestead. They were no longer just fighting for vengeance. They were fighting for the soul of the town they had adopted, for the memory of the family they had lost, and for a future they had dared to believe in. The star of the regulators was about to have its final, bloody dawn. The ruins of the Miller homestead were a skeletal testament to a forgotten tragedy. The charred timbers of the house stood like blackened ribs against the pale, pre-dawn sky. The stone chimney, the only thing still fully intact, was a lonely, defiant headstone. For Jake and Liam, this was not just a battlefield. It was a graveyard, filled with the ghosts of their own past. They had spent the last 2 days turning their childhood home into a death trap. They did not build barricades or dig trenches. Their defenses were more subtle, more in tune with the ghosts of the place. They used the collapsed-in root cellar as a hidden sniper's nest. They rigged the old, creaking barn door to fall and block the main path. They knew every inch of this land, every dip and rise, every shadow. They would use their memories as a weapon. Anna was the wild card. She was not a part of their past, but she was the reason for their future. She took her position not in the ruins themselves, but in a small, wooded copse on a low rise overlooking the homestead. She was the overwatch, the third, unexpected angle of attack. As the sun began to bleed across the horizon, they came. Silas Thorn and his remaining 8 men. They were not a confident army. They were a grim, tense pack of wolves, their nerves frayed, their loyalty held together by nothing more than their shared fear of their leader. They approached the homestead cautiously, fanning out, their rifles ready. Thorn sat on his horse in the center of them, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He had expected a fortress. He saw only ruins. He had expected an army. He saw no one. "They're not here," one of his men said, a note of relief in his voice. They ran. "They are here," Thorn snarled, his eyes scanning the ruins. "They are rats, hiding in their holes. Find them. Burn them out." Two of his men dismounted and began to advance on the burned-out house, their movements hesitant. This was the moment. The first ghost of the homestead made its appearance. From a slit in the stone foundation of the house, where the root cellar was, a rifle cracked. It was a single, sharp, definitive sound. One of the advancing men cried out and fell, clutching his knee. The other men, startled, began firing wildly at the house. From the other side of the ruins, a second rifle answered. Liam. He took down the second man with a clean shot to the shoulder. Two men, firing from two different, concealed positions. It sounded like a much larger force. Thorn's men, already on edge, began to panic. "They're in the house," one of them yelled. "Surround it." This was the mistake Jake and Liam had been counting on. As Thorn and his men focused their attention, their fire, on the main house, they exposed their backs to the low-rise where Anna was hidden. She opened fire. She was not the expert marksman that Liam was, but she was steady, and her shots were true. She didn't aim for the men. She aimed for the horses. Two of the animals went down, screaming, adding to the chaos. Thorn's men were now caught in a three-way crossfire. They were being attacked from the front, from the side, and from their rear. They were trapped in the open, with nowhere to hide. The homestead, which had been a place of slaughter, had become a perfectly designed killing field. Thorn, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, finally saw the true nature of the trap. He roared and spurred his horse, not at the house, but directly at the wooded copse. At Anna. He had identified her as the weakest link, the softest target. It was a mad, suicidal charge. But it was also a direct, personal challenge. Jake and Liam saw him. They both rose from their positions, their attention now on their leader, on the woman who had become the heart of their cause. The battle for the homestead had just become a desperate race to save Anna. The ghosts of the past were now fighting for the future, and the final, bloody reckoning was at hand. Silas Thorn's charge was the act of a cornered, rabid animal. He galloped towards the wooded copse, his pistol blazing, his face a mask of pure, murderous intent. He was no longer a tactician, he was a force of raw, unrestrained fury. Anna stood her ground. The girl who would have once cowered in terror was gone. She fired her rifle, not with the cold precision of Liam, but with a steady, determined rhythm. Her shots were not meant to kill, but to slow him down, to force him to swerve. Jake and Liam, their own battle forgotten, ran from the ruins of the house, their paths converging on the man who was threatening Anna. They were a blur of motion, two avenging angels, their guns speaking in a steady, deadly staccato. The remaining of Thorn's men, seeing their leader engaged in his mad charge, and seeing the two ghost-like figures who had just emerged from the ruins, broke. Their will was shattered. They turned and fled, leaving their leader to his fate. Now, it was just the four of them in the clearing, the final players in a drama that had been years in the making. Thorn's horse, struck by a bullet from Liam's rifle, went down, sending him sprawling into the dust just yards from the tree line where Anna was hidden. He came up, bruised and bleeding, but still on his feet, his pistol still in his hand. He saw Jake and Liam closing in from either side. He was trapped. He made his final, desperate choice. He turned and lunged into the trees, towards Anna. If he was going to die, he would take the cause of his downfall with him. Anna fired her last shot, the bullet tearing through the sleeve of his coat, but not stopping him. He crashed through the brush and was on her. He was a big man, and his weight bore her to the ground. His hand, strong as an iron claw, closed around her throat. "I'll see you in hell," he snarled, his face inches from hers. She fought, clawing at his face, but she was no match for his brute strength. Her vision began to dim, black spots dancing in her eyes. At that moment, the twins arrived. They did not fire. It was too close, too risky. They threw themselves at Thorn, a silent, synchronized attack. Liam grabbed the arm that held the pistol, wrenching it back. Jake delivered a single, brutal, and definitive blow to the side of Thorne's head with the butt of his own gun. Thorne collapsed, unconscious. The fight was over. They stood in the quiet of the woods, the three of them, breathing heavily, the smell of gunpowder and blood thick in the air. Anna, rubbing her bruised throat, looked at the unconscious form of the man who had been the monster of their lives. Liam, his face a mask of cold, hard grief, raised his pistol to finish it, to finally, after all these years, deliver the justice they had sought. "No," Anna said, her voice a raw, ragged whisper. She put her hand on his arm. "He deserves to die," Liam said, his voice choked with a pain that was 5 years old. "Yes," Anna agreed. "He does. But not by our hands. Not like this." She looked from Liam's anguished face to Jake's cold, hard one. "We are not him. We are not murderers. We are regulators. And we regulate. We don't execute." She was their conscience, the voice of a new kind of justice they had all been fighting for, whether they knew it or not. Slowly, reluctantly, Liam lowered his gun. They tied Silas Thorne up. They were not going to kill him. They were going to give him a fate far worse. They were going to bring him back to the town he had terrorized and let the people, and the law they had established, be his judge. As they rode back to Redemption, with their prisoner in tow, a new quiet peace settled over them. Their war of vengeance was over. Their ghosts had been faced. And in the ashes of their old home, they had not just found justice. They had found themselves. The return to Redemption was a strange, triumphant, and somber affair. The sight of the three regulators riding down the main street, with a bound and beaten Silas Thorne in tow, was a moment that would be etched into the town's memory forever. The people poured out of their homes and businesses, not with shouts of victory, but with a quiet, profound sense of awe. The reign of terror was officially, definitively, over. They turned Thorne over to the town's new, honest sheriff, a man elected by the people. There would be a trial, a real one, with a jury of his peers, same people he had once terrorized. His fate was now in their hands. In the days that followed, the three regulators found themselves in an unfamiliar world. They were no longer outlaws, no longer ghosts. They were heroes. The town celebrated them, offered them a home, offered them the leadership of the very community they had saved. But they were restless. The single-minded purpose that had driven them for so long was gone, and in its absence, they were left with the quiet, difficult question of what came next. Jake and Liam had avenged their family. Their ghosts were at peace, but they were men who had been forged in the crucible of violence and vengeance. They did not know how to live in a world of peace. And Anna, who had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed, was no longer the simple widow who had been content with a quiet life. She had become a leader, a symbol, a force to be reckoned with. The small, quiet life she had once known no longer fit her. They were three people who had been defined by their fight. And now that the fight was over, they were adrift. They stayed in Redemption for a month, helping the town to solidify its new government, to lay the foundations for a real, lasting peace. But they all knew they could not stay. The West was still a wild and tame place. There were other Thorns, other towns living in fear. Their work was not done. The whisper of the regulators had become a roar, and that roar had been heard far beyond the small valley of Redemption. People began to seek them out. A delegation from a small mining camp, being squeezed by a corrupt railroad baron. A group of farmers whose water rights were being stolen by a powerful cattle king. They had a new purpose now, not of vengeance, but of justice. They had become the conscience of the frontier, a small, mobile force for good in a land that had too little of it. The day they rode out of Redemption was not a sad one. The entire town came to see them off. It was a fond farewell to the three people who had saved them, and a blessing for the new journey they were about to undertake. Anna, Jake, and Liam rode out, not as two avenging brothers and the woman they had saved, but as the three founding members of the regulators. They were no longer defined by the ghosts of their past, but by the promise of their future. They were an alliance of the damned, who had found their own redemption, not in vengeance, but in service. The star that had been a symbol of a lost sister was now a symbol of hope for the entire territory. It was a heavy weight to carry, but it was a weight they would carry together. The legend of the regulators grew with each passing season. They became a myth, a campfire story told in the far-flung, lawless corners of the West. They said that when a town was in the grip of a tyrant, when the law was blind or bought, you could leave a single, five-pointed star drawn in the dust, and help would come. Jake, Liam, and Anna were no longer just three people. They were a movement. Others, inspired by their story, began to join them. A former lawman, disgusted by the corruption he had witnessed. A young, fiery Mexican revolutionary who fought for the rights of his people. A freed slave who was a master tracker and a deadly shot with a rifle. They were a motley, and likely army, bound by a single, simple creed to stand for those who could not stand for themselves. They never stayed in one place for long. They were a transient force of justice, appearing where they were needed most, a whirlwind of righteous fury that would descend on a corrupt town, break the back of its oppressors, help the people to establish their own fair law, and then disappear back into the wilderness. Jake remained the hard, pragmatic tactician, the storm of their operation, but the coldness in his eyes was tempered now by a fierce, protective loyalty to the family he had built. He was no longer just an avenger, he was a guardian. Liam was the soul of the regulators, his gentle nature a constant reminder of what they were fighting for. He was the diplomat, the healer, the man who could find the good in even the hardest of men. He was the calm after his brother's storm, and Anna was their heart. She was no longer a fighter, not in the traditional sense. She was the strategist, the planner, the voice of reason. She was the one who saw the bigger picture, who understood that true victory was not won with guns, but with the slow, patient work of building a just and lasting community. Their names became a prayer on the lips of the oppressed, and a curse in the mouths of tyrants. They were loved, and they were feared. They were the living, breathing embodiment of the wild, and tamed, and fiercely independent spirit of the West. They grew older. The lines on their faces deepened. The fire in their eyes was tempered by the wisdom of 100 battles fought and won. One evening, as the three of them sat by a campfire in the high, lonely plains of Montana, looking out at a horizon that was a blaze of purple and gold, Liam turned to his brother. "Do you ever think of it?" he asked softly. "The homestead? What our lives would have been?" Jake was silent for a long time, staring into the flames. "Sometimes," he admitted, his voice a low rumble. "But that life is a ghost. This is real." He looked at Anna, at the woman who had become the anchor of their lives, and a rare, soft smile touched his lips. "We didn't get the life we wanted, but we got the life we were needed for." Anna reached out and took both of their hands. "Our family didn't die," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It just got bigger." They sat in a comfortable silence, three legends under a vast, star-dusted sky. Their work not yet done, their horizon still filled with the promise of another fight, another town to be freed. The ghosts of their past were not gone. They rode with them, a constant, loving memory of the sister who had been their cause, and the family who had been their beginning. Years turned into a decade, and then two. The West was changing. The railroads crisscrossed the plains, bringing with them more people, more towns, and a more formal, structured kind of law. The era of the lone gunman and the vigilante justice was slowly, inexorably, coming to a close. The regulators, once a vital, necessary force, found themselves in a world that was beginning to have less and less need of them. Their battles became fewer, their enemies more subtle corrupt politicians who couldn't be fought with a gun, powerful railroad barons who couldn't be intimidated. The members of their small army began to drift away, finding their own places in the new, tamer West. The former lawman became a real sheriff in a town they had helped to build. The Mexican revolutionary went home to fight a different kind of war. Finally, there were only the three of them again. Jake, Liam, and Anna. They were older now, their hair streaked with gray, their bodies carrying the scars of 100 fights. They found themselves back in redemption. The town was no longer the dusty, fearful place they had first found. It was a thriving, prosperous community, a testament to the power of a people who had taken control of their own destiny. They were welcomed not as saviors, but as old friends, as family. They bought a small piece of land just outside the town, on a low rise that overlooked the valley. It was a quiet, peaceful place. For the first time in their adult lives, they stopped moving. Jake, the storm, found a strange, new peace in the simple, honest work of building a home. Liam, the gentle soul, started a small school, teaching the town's children not just how to read and write, but the stories of their town's own, hard-won history. And Anna, the heart, became the town's matriarch, its unofficial judge, its keeper of the peace. One evening, as the three of them sat on the porch of their new home, watching the sun set, a young boy from the town came running up to them. "The regulators," he said, his eyes wide with a hero-worshipping awe. "Are you really them?" Jake just grunted, a hint of a smile on his face. Liam laughed, a soft, gentle sound. It was Anna who answered. She looked at the boy, and in his eyes, she saw the future of the town, of the West. They had fought so hard to create. "Sometimes," she said, her voice soft and wise. "Sometimes, when the shadows get too long, and good people are afraid to light a candle, the star needs to shine a little brighter." That's all we ever were. The legend of the regulators would live on, a story told to generations of children in the town of Redemption. A story of two avenging brothers and the brave widow who had joined them. A story of how a whisper had become a roar. But for the three people who sat on the porch, watching the last of the sun's light fade from the sky, the story was a simpler one. It was the story of a family, forged in fire, and of a promise, kept. The star of the regulators had not set. It had just found its permanent place in the quiet, peaceful sky of home.